16th birthday. We girls always wish for the day to turn 16 years old, consider ourselves adults, and make our parents let us go where we want. The same happened in my case. I wanted to go to the Appalachian Trail, and my parents let me go there. It all happened in 2011, on my birthday. I cut the cake for my 16th birthday, and Dad handed me an envelope with some money and a note. "It's for your trip to the Appalachian Trail with your friends." Instantly, I hugged him and Mom. After the cake, I just ran to my room, packed my gear, while my friends Jess and Ross did the same when they got home from the party. We were all excited to go together, as it would be our first trip. We had been there before, but with school and classmates. This time, we were going by ourselves with no support system. Dad, though, was worried about us. He connected me to a counselor named James. He would guide us to a cool and secluded spot and ensure to keep an eye on us. The next day, Ross became the driver. She picked up Jess and me, and then we set out for the adventure. All the way we followed maps, while I stayed connected to Dad and Ross and Jess to their parents. As we were about to reach, James called me. He WhatsApped me a location, and we followed it to reach the place. There, he greeted us. He helped us park the car in the lot and took us to his cabin. It was a vintage-vibed cabin with an all-wooden structure. He talked to us about ourselves and then took us to the deep woods. "Since David told me that you want a remote spot, here it is," he said, bringing us to the coolest spot. It had a lake nearby with trees all around. "It's near my camp, so I can check on you every few hours. So, happy trip." He wished us and walked away. We three partied. We pitched our camp, set up a fire, and stayed near it all day long. We brought a saucepan and ramen noodles too, so we cooked them and had it with beer. The sunset was perfectly visible from there, so we watched it silently. The place, that moment, and the company I had all felt like my own little paradise. As the sun was setting and we were watching it, the noise of a car distracted us. At that moment, I noticed a group in a camper parked not far from us. 5 of them, mostly older men, and 1 woman. At first, I didn't think much of it. People come to campgrounds for the same reasons: relaxation, peace, and a break from the world. Yet, there was something weird about them. They weren't laughing or talking like normal campers do. Instead, they watched us. One man in particular stood out, a burly figure with dark eyes that felt too invasive. He kept staring at me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Jess and Ross didn't seem bothered, so I pushed the feeling aside and focused on enjoying the evening. As we cooked dinner over the fire and shared ghost stories, I started to relax. The relaxation after ages let us have a sound sleep. The same camp and support let us sleep calmly. Last year with school, it was horrible to sleep because of constant, typical forest sounds. However, this time, we came prepared. We crawled into the tent when our eyes were begging us to shut them down and sleep. That's why the next day, I woke up a little late. Jess and Ross were still asleep. I came outside and enjoyed the scene. After that, I just grabbed my fishing rod and walked down to the lake. The stillness of the water and the crisp morning air felt calming. For a while, it was just me and the gentle tug of the fishing line. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw him, the man from the camper. He was standing too close, a fake, almost eerie smile plastered on his face. My chest tightened as he started asking me questions. At first, they were harmless enough. "Are you here with your family? And do you like fishing?" But then his tone shifted. His questions became invasive, personal, and inappropriate. "Do your friends know where you are right now?" he asked, his voice low and unsettling. I forced a laugh, muttered a vague response, and gathered my things. "I should get back," I said, trying to sound casual. He followed me. The walk back to the tent felt endless. I kept my pace brisk, but not too hurried, hoping he would lose interest. On the way, I called James, but he didn't pick up. I assumed he must have been at our place. When I reached our camp, I expected the man to stop, but he didn't, and James wasn't there. The man kept closing the gap, his presence growing more aggressive. Fear started to spill inside me, and I bolted. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward the trail where my friends had gone for a walk. I came to know they were there as they texted me while I was fishing. While walking on the trail, I called out for them, and when they appeared around the bend, relief washed over me. It wasn't over. The man was still following me, his demeanor angrier now. I clung to Jess's arm as she and Ross turned to confront him. "What do you want?" Ross demanded, stepping in front of me, taking out her pistol from her back pocket. The man smirked, but didn't say a word. That's when Ross fired her pistol at both his legs. He fell. To ensure our safety, she shot at his hands and palms. Eventually, he yelled in pain, and we ran to our camp. We reached our place soon and were a little traumatized. Ross was afraid the most since it was her first time using a pistol, and that too, on a man. We called her our brave soldier. Soon, James came to us. "Hey, you called?" he asked. I told him everything. "Okay, for a night, please stay at my cabin. It's unsafe. Or, if you have no issue, I could camp here too." We went with the second option. We had great company with him. He was a fun guy. Because of James, we stayed for the rest of the weekend, but the mood had shifted. The lake didn't feel serene anymore. The cliffs seemed ominous, and every shadow in the woods made me jump. The next day, after lunch, we left for city life again. James already informed Dad about what we faced. He really supported us and helped Ross a lot. Ross stayed at my home for 2 days before going home. Those few days were terrifying for us, but after a week, we returned to normal and resumed our old lives. It's been more than 10 years now, but we still remember it because we faced it at such a young age. After that, I went hiking multiple times with new groups and campers. Ross is now a counselor at Maryland State Forest, and Jess camps as a hobby. We always gather at the same place and laugh a lot because that's what life is. Solo camping at a secluded spot is love. There are no distractions, no gossip, and no worldly fun. It's just you and nature. That's why I always go myself for hiking and camping on the Appalachian Trail once every 3 months. It helps me collect stories and experiences. However, some of them are super weird, like the one I am going to tell you. It all happened in 2019 when I went to the woods of North Carolina. It all started like any other camping trip. I had spent 3 days deep in the forest, hiking, fishing, and sitting by a crackling fire under a sky full of stars. It was perfect. On the morning of my departure, I packed up my tent and supplies, loaded my old truck, and headed back to civilization. The narrow, winding road out of the woods was quiet and lined with tall pine trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. I was a few miles from the nearest highway when I saw a black trash bag lying on the side of the road. At first, I didn't think much of it because people litter all the time, especially near forested areas. But as I drove closer, I noticed something odd about the shape of the bag. It wasn't the usual, lumpy, misshapen form of discarded garbage. It was long and narrow, almost as if something rigid was inside. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out of my truck. The air was thick, trying to stop me from stepping forward, but I outsmarted the wind. Yet still, as I approached the bag, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. Something felt weird. The bag was tied tightly at the top, but a small tear near the bottom revealed a pale, fleshy color. I shook back. My stomach churned, and my mind raced with questions, asking itself if it had a human body. With trembling hands, I crouched down and used a stick to pull the tear wider. What I saw turned all doubts right, leaving my breath stuck in my throat because it was a bloody human leg. Upon seeing it, I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a moment, I stood there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. This sort of thing didn't happen, at least not to people like me, not on a quiet road in the middle of nowhere. I scrambled back to my truck and grabbed my phone. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to steady my nerves as I explained what I'd found. She told me to stay where I was and wait for the authorities. Waiting for minutes felt like hours. I sat in my truck, the bag visible in my rearview mirror as my mind raced with questions. Whose leg was it? How did it end up here? Was there more in the woods nearby? Every creak of the trees made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When the police arrived, they quickly cordoned off the area. 2 officers approached me while others examined the bag. I told them everything, how I found it, what I saw. They asked me to wait while they conducted their initial investigation. From the corner of my eye, I saw one of the officers open the bag fully. His face turned pale, and he quickly stepped away, muttering something to his colleague. They didn't tell me much before letting me leave, only that they would follow up if they needed more information. I drove away, but the image of that bag and its contents stayed with me. The whole way, I played songs to distract myself and focus on driving. After 3 hours, I returned home safely, but I could not come out of the moment I had there when I saw a leg. Weeks passed, and I kept an eye on the news, hoping for some update, some resolution. But nothing came. The story appeared briefly in local reports. Human remains found in North Carolina woods. No further details were released. No one came forward to claim the remains. No suspects were identified. It was as if the legs had appeared out of thin air, a grim mystery with no beginning or end. After a month, I was back to normal life, yet deep inside, the experience stayed with me. I started going camping again. Following the previous camping trip, in the next one, I found a whole human dead body. It also shook me, and in the third one, I found the eyes of a dead person just outside my camp. Such experiences did not harden my soul, but made me realize that the forest is home to the weirdest stuff, and we need to accept it instead of getting afraid of it. It's been years now, and I have moved on. I am a hiking guide for many, and to all of them, I tell one thing: they will experience the weirdest stuff. It's okay if they are not prepared, but what's not okay is getting stuck in past experiences for 10 years or more. That experience is still in my mind, but I don't let it affect my present because the world is meant to be explored, not to be grieved over something that is past. Chris and I were camping enthusiasts. After turning 18, we promised to always go hiking once a year. However, what we faced at the age of 21 was horrible, leading us to take a break from that stupid promise. Back in 2020, Chris and I decided to go to Hocking Hills State Park. It's a part of the Appalachian Mountains. There, we chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any trails. It was perfect. The first day passed in the kind of peaceful silence you only find in nature. We set up camp, made a fire, and swapped stories over charred hot dogs and a shared flask. The stars above were impossibly bright, the kind of view you can't get anywhere near the city. By the second night, Chris was done with the woods silence. "Man, this is great and all, but I think I get why you usually do this solo," he joked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Too much quiet can mess with your head." I laughed. "Wait until the trees start talking to you." He didn't find that funny. We called it a night soon after, zipping into our respective sleeping bags under the thin roof of our tent. It was sometime after midnight when I heard a faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. I sat up, my ears straining. Chris stirred beside me. "You hear that?" he mumbled, groggily. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Something's moving out there." We grabbed our flashlights and crept out of the tent, the cold air biting at our skin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows. The woods were too still, except for the sound of twigs snapping somewhere nearby. We scanned the trees with our beams of light, but saw nothing. Then we heard a low, growling noise. It made the hair on the back of my neck and hands stand up. "What the hell is that?" Chris whispered in a barely audible voice. I couldn't answer. The sound came again, closer this time. We turned toward it and stood still. Standing just beyond the glow of our flashlights was a deer. At least, I thought it was a deer. It was unlike any I'd seen before. Its coat was pitch black, blending seamlessly with the night, and its eyes didn't reflect the light as they should have. They were dull, lifeless. The deer stomped its front hoof, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. It tilted its head, almost as if it were studying us. Then it let out a sound I'll never forget. It was a guttural laugh, just like a human. It wasn't even an animal sound. It was a human laugh coming from this thing. Chris gasped audibly, and I felt my stomach drop. "We need to go," he muttered, already taking a step back, trying to hold my hand. We both needed the support of each other. Before we could move, the deer did something that turned my fear into pure, primal terror. It stood up. Slowly, unnaturally, it rose onto its hind legs, its body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was towering now, its hollow eyes locked on us. And then it spoke, or at least, it sounded like it tried to. The laugh turned into a garbled, raspy noise that almost formed words, but not quite. Chris didn't wait for me to react. He bolted, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. I followed, my legs trembling beneath me. The woods, once so serene, now felt alive with unseen threats. Branches scratched at my arms, and roots seemed to reach up to trip me. Behind us, the stomping resumed, faster this time, as if the creature was giving chase. We didn't stop running until we were back at the main trail, the faint orange glow of a ranger station visible in the distance. Only then did we dare to look back. There was nothing. The woods were silent again, as if we'd imagined the whole thing. We just sat in our car and drove away. Instead of going anywhere, we drove to the nearby camper's famous site and stayed for the night. The next day, we went back to our campsite. We packed our things and drove home. On the way, we stopped near the ranger station, but I resisted. "Do you think they will listen to us?" I asked. The question was enough for Chris to change his decision. He drove for 6 straight hours. That day, I stayed at his home, recalling what we had experienced. For a week, we kept thinking about that black deer. After that, we got back to normal life, but decided not to go camping the next year. After that break, we went again with different experts, and it really helped us explore the place. However, one thing is for sure, some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood. You must have planned a trip to Europe after your honeymoon, but we planned a week-long hiking trip to Blackwood Forest. Mia and I are nature lovers. We even met while camping, where she once shot a robber and countless deer, something that made me fall in love with her. So, after the wedding, we got back into our rough clothes, packed our gear, and set off for an adventure. Mia has a dominating personality, brave and strong. She loves to lead, yet the only thing she hates is driving. So, I drove the car while she guided me. We reached the forest in the early afternoon when the sun was up, with clouds scattered across the sky. I parked near the gate, and we stepped out to get back to where it all started. The day was perfect. Sunlight streamed through the canopy of trees as we hiked the trails of Blackwood Forest, laughing, talking, and soaking in the peace only nature could offer. By evening, We had set up our tent near a small creek. We roasted marshmallows over the fire, talked about our dreams, and listened to the symphony of the forest. "Best idea you've ever had," Mia said, her face glowing in the firelight, her eyes alive with happiness. I smiled, reaching for her hand. "Anything for you." The night felt magical. We stayed outside our camp all night, enjoying the serenity. The week passed happily, crossing miles and reaching peaks we had dreamt of. Along the way, we met people and heard strange noises, but we were used to it. Forests and mountains are hubs of unnatural beings and eerie phenomena, so it's better to come prepared. Our past experiences had prepared us for that, but not for what we faced later. On the last day, we packed our gear and started walking down. We eventually reached our car, and I drove again. We had a long drive back the next morning, so we decided to head toward the main road now and rest in a nearby inn. The forest road was quiet, and the world beyond the windshield seemed cloaked in darkness. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath our tires and the occasional hoot of an owl. Mia leaned her head against the window, tired but content, while I drove slowly, keeping an eye out for any wildlife that might dart across the road. About 15 minutes from the main highway, I spotted something in the distance. At first, it looked like litter bags, but as I came closer, my confusion grew, my stomach churning with unease. It was a car, flipped over on its roof, the metal mangled and the windows shattered. Smoke hissed faintly from the engine, and the entire scene looked disturbingly fresh. "Jake, stop!" Mia gasped, sitting upright. I pulled over and parked on the shoulder. For a moment, neither of us moved, staring in shock at the wreck. "We have to check if someone's inside," Mia urged, her voice trembling. Like all women, she always wants to help others. I nodded, though my hands were shaking. Grabbing my phone for its flashlight, I stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline hit me immediately. Mia followed close behind. As we approached, the interior of the car came into view. A man was slumped against the driver's seat, his head twisted unnaturally with his eyes facing the seat. His face was pale and lifeless, with a streak of blood running down his temple. "Fuck," Mia whispered, clutching her mouth. "Sir, can you hear me?" There was no response. My throat tightened as I searched for any sign of life, a twitch, a breath, anything. Nothing. "He's gone," I said, my voice hollow. Mia stepped back, tears glistening in her eyes. I was sure it triggered memories of her father's death 5 years ago in a car accident. They had been asleep at home when the police called to inform them of the tragedy. "What do we do?" she asked. I hesitated, staring at the man. He couldn't have been older than 30, his jacket still neatly buttoned as if he'd been on his way to something important. A wedding ring glinted faintly on his left hand. "We should call for help," she said, pulling out her phone with trembling hands, and reported the accident, giving them as much detail as she could. The dispatcher assured us that help was on the way and advised us to stay clear of the wreck for our safety. As we waited, the stillness of the night felt suffocating. The chirping crickets and rustling leaves now seemed eerie, as though the forest itself mourned. "Do you think he was alone?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I hope so," I replied, though the thought of anyone else, especially a child, being in the car made my chest tighten. We stood in silence, staring at the wreck. My mind raced with questions. What had caused the accident? Was he driving too fast? Did an animal run onto the road? Or had he simply fallen asleep at the wheel? "He must have been coming from somewhere," Mia murmured. "Or going to someone." Her words sent a chill through me. The man's wedding ring caught the light again, and I couldn't help but think of his spouse, waiting for him, unaware of what had happened. The sound of sirens eventually broke the silence. Red and blue lights painted the trees as an ambulance and a police car arrived. The paramedics confirmed what we already knew: the man was gone. The police took our statements, asking if we'd seen anything unusual or anyone else on the road. We shook our heads. After ensuring there was nothing more we could do, they told us we were free to go. As we drove away, the scene replayed in my mind. The lifeless man, the crumpled car, the eerie silence, it was all burned into my memory. Mia sat quietly, staring out the window, just as shaken. When we reached the inn, neither of us could sleep. We lay in bed, holding each other, the weight of the night pressing down on us. What if we'd gotten there earlier? Could we have helped him? I didn't know how to answer. The what-ifs were endless, and the guilt, though irrational, gnawed at me. Days later, we learned nothing about the man. No news reports, no follow-ups. It was as if he'd vanished from the world entirely. Yet, he stayed in our minds. Our lives moved on, but the mystery remained unsolved, the sad part of the forest, its unsolved puzzles. Exams ended, and we needed a break. That's why we planned a camping trip to the Smoky Mountains, where we would stay for a weekend. None of us had issues. It was a dream-perfect plan. The gear was packed last minute, and we set off for the journey early in the morning from my home. The trip started out as you'd expect. Laughter, banter, and the rush of adrenaline as we navigated through pristine, snow-covered trails. We had set up camp in a small clearing with towering pines surrounding us, a serene picture straight out of a postcard. But by the third day, the weather began to shift. What had been a gentle snowfall turned into a raging blizzard. "Let's hit the slopes before it gets worse," Marcus suggested. He was always the daredevil of the group, the one who made even the reckless feel cautious. We all hesitated, looking at the darkening sky. But the spirit of adventure and Marcus's confidence won over our better judgment. Bundling up, we grabbed our gear and set off, excited to ski through the fresh powder despite the ominous winds whispering through the trees. At first, it was exhilarating. The untouched snow crunched beneath our skis, and the icy air stung our cheeks. But within an hour, the storm truly hit. The wind howled around us. Snow fell in sheets, thick and relentless, and the mountain we'd been navigating became a white abyss. "I think we're heading the wrong way," I shouted over the wind, my voice barely audible. "We just need to keep going downhill," Marcus replied, his voice resolute but tinged with doubt. The downhill path led nowhere recognizable. The trees, once friendly landmarks, loomed like strangers in the suffocating storm. We trudged on, our skis becoming more of a burden than a help, sinking into the snowdrifts. "Should we stop and wait it out?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with fear and cold. "We can't," Marcus answered. "We'll freeze. We have to keep moving." Hours passed, though it felt like days. Every step became harder as exhaustion set in. The biting cold seeped through every layer of clothing, and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Was this it? Were we going to be one of those tragic stories you hear about the mountains? Finally, as night fell and the storm raged on, we stumbled onto a snow-covered road. Relief was short-lived. There was no sign of civilization, just the endless storm. Then, faintly, headlights appeared in the distance. We waved frantically, half mad with desperation. The driver stopped a man in his 60s, with a weathered face and a heavy southern accent. "What in the world are you doing out here?" he asked, incredulous as we clambered into his truck, shaking with cold and gratitude. We didn't have the energy to explain much, only mumbling about the storm and being lost. He drove us to a nearby motel, its neon sign a beacon of salvation. That night, we huddled in the motel room, too drained to do anything but sleep. But our belongings were still at the campsite, and we knew we couldn't leave them behind. The next morning, the storm had eased, but the world outside was still a wasteland. The air was sharp and biting, and the snow glittered under the weak winter sun. "Do we really have to go back?" Sarah asked, clutching her coffee like it was her lifeline. "We don't have a choice," Marcus said grimly. The journey back was brutal. The wind lashed at us, and ice coated the paths, making every step a battle. The landscape was unrecognizable, transformed by the storm. More than once, we slipped and fell, bruising knees and egos. When we finally reached the campsite, it was a mess. The tent had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and our belongings were scattered and half-buried. We worked quickly, gathering what we could and packing it into our gear. "We need to get out of here before it gets worse again," I said, glancing at the ominous clouds gathering on the horizon. The hike back to the road was no easier than the trek to the campsite. By the time we reached the car, we were all battered, exhausted, and silent. The drive home felt surreal, as if we were leaving behind not just the mountains, but a part of ourselves. In the weeks that followed, the trip stayed with us, creeping into our dreams and conversations. None of us could shake the memory of the storm, the feeling of being lost in an endless sea of white, the sheer helplessness. "It's funny," Sarah said one evening when we met up, "how the thing we looked forward to the most is now what haunts me the most." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Smoky Mountains, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, had become a place of ghosts, both real and imagined. The mountains had tested us, humbled us, and left a mark that would never fade. Nature, we learned, doesn't care about plans. It's ruthless. It took us time to get back to normal, and once we were back on track, we never visited the same place in winter again.